Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me to this conference. So I would like first say two things. First is that we are changing the subject a little bit, but as we are on a very multi-diverse conference, so we are, I think, prepared to be in this mode of changing. And second, I will be reading the text. You know, my 7-year-old daughter, she's asking me sometimes questions, and she's expecting the answer, and then she's like sitting and listening to me, and then she's saying, "Mommy, please, do not comment what you just said." So I decided to read and stick to the paper, to be precise and not to take your time too much. So. Rob Nixon, in his famous book, Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor, wrote, "The effects of the disaster and then crisis are their consequences can only be understood if we consider its complex nature and multi-faced harm with environmental, social, economic, and cultural dimension. Each time, in each crisis, we find that previously designed scientific devices and intervention infrastructures are not sufficient to understand and study the effects of the event, both from a human and non-human harm perspective. That is why experimental practices focus on dealing with crises, practices that are characterized by care and can approach standardized methods of collecting data of evidence of violence turned out to be crucial. So in today's presentation, I would like to refer to 3 crisis situations caused by nuclear disaster, military crisis, violence, and climate change, and to look in their context and selected experimental and artistic media practices that provide new ways of working with crisis. Thus, as they indicate the social and environmental agency of these activities, which I am really consider of this, and I think it's important in this case. Not in every case of art, but in the case of crisis, I think this agency is important. They also show transgressions within the methodology of art itself towards in-depth, precisely designed and performed research that is necessary to gain agency, responsibility, and ethics, as well as approach with care in practice that concerns such complex, multi-threatened topics. So, I will check now. So let me start from nuclear disaster. On 11 March 2011, a powerful earthquake struck Honshu, Japan. The earthquake triggered tsunami affected 20 different countries in the Pacific region, yet Japan suffered most of the damage. The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant experienced a catastrophic nuclear incident at that time. The partial meltdown of the reactor cores led to the significant radiation emissions into the atmosphere and the ocean. As the risk of tsunami and earthquakes in this part of the world is well known, recommendations for power plant safeguards have been repeatedly flagged by numerous organizations, but they were ignored. And too low anti-tsunami embankment increased the risk of contamination of people and environment. During the initial weeks of the disaster, in particular, citizens were given little information concerning actual radiation levels, and what was presented both by officials and in the media was often incomplete or even contradictory. The lack of reliable information about the contamination and ensuing information chaos brought about another crisis due to the population's fear of consequences of exposure to radiation. Once again, just as at Chernobyl, the infrastructure failed when it should have informed the public, so the citizens could realistically begin to act under the circumstances. Amid all this confusion of disinformation, lack of public access to data on radiation, project emerged that aimed to develop new methods of working with disaster, with people and the environment who were affected by violence. There were lots of grassroots initiatives to let the public have access to data about radioactive contamination. One of the projects to record the effects from different perspectives, more artistic, of the disaster was Don't Follow the Wind. It was created by the Japanese collective Chimpon, who decided to see, bear witness to, and disseminate the understanding of what was happening in the Fukushima exclusion zone. What is also significant in the entire course of this project is giving voice to those who were forced to leave and couldn't speak. One of the project's major parts took place in 2015, when it was possible to temporarily stay in some parts of the zone. That time artists were doing field work, and then the works were installed in various places in the zone. But the project could not be seen by audience at that time due to the high radiation contamination. This was a kind of inaccessible exhibition. One of the works of the project, Home, was made by Meiro Kozumi. The artist spoke with residents of one of the buildings and reports the encounter as following. I spent a day with Mr. Y at his old house, which he had to evacuate immediately after the nuclear incident. We walked around inside the collapsing house. Everything was scattered on the floor and covered with dust and mold. He told me about all memories attached to the house, including stories from his childhood, his family life with his wife and 2 children. He also talked to me about the anxiety and anger he had around the whole situation and the disinformation. I asked Mr. Y to imagine and improvise the conversation he would have with his wife over this first dinner, if they could ever come back to their house. He agreed, and we took several takes, and then I mixed the sound, and it became the audio work of the installed in his old house. However, this is a very, very simple work, but it has its own important implication for grasping the function of memory recording in the experience of nuclear disaster. Koizumi not only records the residents' memory, but incorporates somehow the past and present into the temporally unknown future, and thus into the projected moment when residents return to their homes in the zone. Memory and narratives thus oscillate in space-time mattering, managed by the half-life of harmful particles. Don't Follow the Wind project included also a collectively done artistic documentary film which gives an account of the reality in Fukushima. They collected narratives were played on headphones made by 3 generations of Fukushima families. It's crucial to realize that more than 160,000 Fukushima residents were evacuated. Most took only a few belongings with them because they assumed they would return soon. After the disaster, some residents were allowed to visit their homes 15 times a year for 7 hours. Later, the number of the visits were increased to 30 a year. Visiting one's own home in the exclusion zone and staying in one's own living space, wearing clothing protecting against biological hazard was a highly alienating and affective experience for many residents. That's why some of the artists involved in the project also tried to bring life back to the object. Like Takeuchi Kota, who proposed a way to activate memory of the disaster with materials and objects. With the permission of selected residents, he decided to bring life to the clothes left behind the zone. This is how a series of time travelers' photographs were created, featuring both artists and residents in clothes initially abundant in the zone. Some of these photos, as the artist's contribution to the Follow the Wind exhibition, remain in the residents' homes. Some are continuing as ongoing projects. Another work that records material dimension of the zone was work by Eva and Franco Mates. In Fukushima Texture Park, they took pictures of various textures of surface inside and outside exclusion zone, including floors, tatami, walls, waste, grass, sidewalks, etc. And they turn each photo into digital graphic texture. The texture files can be freely downloaded and used without copyright restriction. To mark the places they had taken the photographs, the artist installed transparent plexiglass panels in those places. The texture do not depict the disaster. They come, as artist says, from the disaster, evoking it and carrying the sense of incomprehension of the event. Will this image be loaded like the place they come from? Will they contain the emit potent energy, or will they fade into the background of computers? Artists ask. All the works making up in 2015 exhibition Don't Follow the Wind were made in collaboration with residents. This intervention neither showed the works nor documentation, but rather, they are site-specific projects bringing forward stories and experience of the residents and knowledge from the inaccessible zone. The project was largely invisible, a condition akin to radiation itself, only to be viewed in the future when former residents can return. As one of the artists wrote, the whole exhibition is a material witness to contamination and the durational separation of the former residents, many of whom feel the artworks are their placeholders when they are away. The other grassroots way of collecting, visualizing, and sharing radiation data were proposed by photographer Masamichi Kagaya in collaboration with biologist Satoshi Mori. The team created Autoradiograph, which is online archive that uses a scientific, very well-known method for studying radiation of objects. Even since the disaster, Kagaya and Mori have scanned in Fukushima zone a variety of objects, revealing and visualizing their radiation levels. Each such scan, autoradiograph as they call it, comes with a specification describing the object in detail, its actual level of radiation, its location on map, a video documentation of when the object was obtained, or a written commentary on how the object was obtained and who handed it over to the study and when. The archive initially collected scans radioactive objects from Fukushima zone, but then they extended it to the objects from Chernobyl. Yes, and that now the autoradiograph is Fukushima and Chernobyl objects. So the intention of autoradiograph is to visualize a phenomenon that lacks its visual representation, which makes it accessible to mythologization and political manipulation of radiation. Autoradiograph is intended to be socially shared proof that radiation exists, and the level on which it exists is very important, because it's not about to scare people, but to share with people knowledge about the level of radiation. In the Fukushima crisis caused by nuclear disaster, it was important to understand the overlapping spectra of data of different temporal, social, economic, cultural, and political ranges, as the artistic project Don't Follow the Wind and Autoradiograph are bringing. Only the interference between all those layers demonstrates the multi-level tension, mutation, and oscillations that make up the understanding socially and environmentally what really happened in Fukushima. Oh, you can see also here mushrooms from Fukushima. Yes, another example will be connected to the conflicts and war violence. In 2020, Cloud Studies, project by very famous group Forensic Architecture, established by architect and researcher Eyal Weizmann in 2010, premiered during the exhibition Critical Zones, curated by Peter Weibel and Bruno Latour. It is a multimedia project, produce a new epistemic media perspective, revealing combined force of violence against people and the environment. Indeed, Cloud Studies reveals forms of total violence, which is impossible to defend ourselves. The project won the Ars Electronica 2021 Golden Nika Award in Artificial Intelligence and Live Art. The FA spans its study between two extremes of violence resulting from the weaponization of clouds and atmosphere. One of these is a bomb cloud. The other is airborne chemicals, poisons, which are difficult to detect and naturalized, and which destroy the habitat of all species. Today I'm going to refer to cloud studies as a bomb cloud. In 2017, the World Meteorological Organization published a new classification of clouds with a few new types. Special clouds, artificial clouds. There were, among others, homogenitus, a cloud resulting from humanity activity formed due to the impact of industrial infrastructure, and flammagenitus, a cloud resulting from huge fires, especially hard to control, such as forest fires. Both these examples, from the perspective of environmental crisis and critical discourse on the Anthropocene, reveal the interdependence of the processes of technologization, industrialization, in its global dimension with the transformation of biosphere. But forensic architecture cloud studies proposes yet another type of special cloud, which is by virtue of its morphology, could expand the atlas developed by World Meteorological Organization. It is the bomb clouds. Bomb clouds as architecture in gaseous form, to be understood and represented in using experimental media tools. But clouds have always been data storage media, as A.L. Weizmann says. Interestingly, in 19th century, one of the last natural collaborations between scientists and artists in trying to describe and classify clouds involved art practitioners and historians like John Ruskin, painters like John Constable with his cloud study project, and amateur British scientists, meteorologists like Luke Howard. Following this collaboration and this inspiration, forensic architecture in cloud studies revealed technological patterns of violence and molecular policies of brutality. One of the examples of the cloud study series is the project called The Use of White Phosphorus Munition in Urban Environments. Carried out jointly by Forensic Architecture and C2 Research, they are also a collective of architects. The following, it's concerned the Israeli armies used in 2008 and 2009 in Gaza, little known at that time, weapon, white phosphorus munition. Falling to the ground and burning phosphorus led to widespread fires, fatal burns, and death. The smoke formed by the combustion of phosphorus is very dense and poison to all living organisms. The use of white phosphorus by Israeli troops was documented on photographs and videos by many eyewitness and human rights organizations from both Palestine and Israel. Initially, the Israeli army, of course, denied that they used the phosphorus. But thanks to all those videos and photographs, forensic architecture could analyze the phosphorus clouds. In the research on study clouds and its media elaboration, it was the main case to develop a report using novel methods to obtain data on post-explosion clouds. The report was presented in 2012 in a UN office at Geneva. Later on, it was submitted to Israeli High Court of Justice. All of these actions and strong public pressure led to a 2013 declaration of the Israeli military that it would stop using white phosphorus munition in populated areas. Clouds are always double. Seen from the outside, they are measurable objects. Seen from within, they are experimental conditions of optical blur and atmospheric obscurity. Today's clouds are both environmental and political. Their toxic fog is easily surrounded by little doubt. When post-truth and denialism obscure acts of violence and compound the harm, we, the inhabitants of toxic clouds, must find new ways of resistance. as A.L. Weizmann says. Weizmann and Fuller wrote a book, Investigative Aesthetics, and this kind of methodology they called hyper-aesthetics, and described the concept as a proposal for expressing experimental forensic practice used by artists, researchers, and activists to reveal and follow traces of violence in a technologically censored world. Importantly, the sensor that records data on violence can be everything, Weizmann says. Animate and inanimate matter, but also technological information acquisition system, as well as sites on web that record and preserve data. Thus, hyper-aesthetics is expanded and branch methodology in which both sensing and making sense are intensified. The last example will come from ecological and climate crisis. Ice Course. It's an experimental documentary, artistic experimental documentary film from 2019. It's a part of artist Susan Shupley multi-layer research project Learning from Ice, which explores the way in which different knowledge practices engage with the situated material condition of ice and the politics of cold. In the film, ice cores are shown in their multiple habitats: ice fields, laboratories, cryoarchives, refrigerated trucks surrounded by complex technological and scientific apparatuses and subjected to the acts of resizing and analysis by researchers studying their chemical composition. Ice cores are extracted and then travel to institutions that are often on the other side of the planet, sometimes only to be shipped away, again, to other laboratories and research centers. Ice cores, from this perspective, are not only the form of natural archives or climate testimony available to us, but post-extraction, they transform the dense frozen water of glaciers into latent archives of atmosphere, providing evidence of recent and significant spikes in greenhouse gases. In scientific language, ice cores contain data proxies. They are empirical objects which are able to provide indirect measurements of past climate conditions. Although the information about climate is indirect, they have the peculiarity of being made of material traces, thus giving direct access to the evidence that is the air encapsulated from the past. That is why Susan Shupley calls them double agents. As material witness, they have an evidential role and register experimental events. As scientific instruments, they also expose the practices and procedures that enable such matter to bear witness. Shupley, as an artist researcher, uses transversal methodology in her work, revealing hidden policies, which is the most important thing, I think, for her, governing aesthetics and modes of knowledge production. Ice cores can constitute a proxy data resource not only for paleometeorology, but also for other dynamic processes, including technological, political, colonial, and military ones. Ice is therefore a metonymy for complex and tangled processes. An illustrative example of the policies of cold and understanding through the media lens is film and audio recording made by Shupley in Svalbard, an archipelago in Arctic Ocean. This is the lens of linking the climate crisis with energy and military crisis and broadly defined field of Anthropocene practice. But it's also a special area when military, political, scientific, and energy interests clash. An area with particularly dense infrastructure of remote sensing technologies, an area where Russian nuclear submarines are located, over which military satellites fly, a zone of special economic conditions and energy influence of countries such as Norway, Russia, Denmark, and the UK. Her work, entitled Arctic Archipelago, Arctic archipelago was shot during the circumnavigation of Spitsbergen in the Svalbard Arctic archipelago in August 2020 as a part of inquiry into sea ice and the geopolitics of the circumpolar north. The challenge with this visual material, as she's saying about this, is that of denaturalizing the image. What can be seen, sensed, and known about these spaces beyond the melancholic register of melting ice. The methods and methodologies of experimental practices discussed above arise from very different experience of crisis, because each crisis has different course, specificity, and consequences for people and the environment. Therefore, each time within the given problems, there is a need to develop new research and artistic approaches. The projects don't follow the wind, and the autoradiograph are more focused on recording the experience and trauma in Fukushima zone. Building a kind of new intimacy and archiving of violence as stretched between the past, the present, and inhuman dimension of the future constructed by the decay of radioactive particles. The works of Forensic Architecture Group results from classic painting studies, the precision of using painting as a tool for recording the details of reality. And they work, these methods, are subjected to mediatization, and in a situation of war crisis, they constitute testimony evidence, which being developed using artistic and scientific practices, media practices basically, gains its new agency for justice. Finally, Susan Shupley works are an example of art as an in-depth, multi-stage and multi-year study of phenomena related to the climate crisis. They are all examples of the combination of media and research practices as inseparable forms of data collection and preservation. However, all of them are characterized by precisely defined research field, consciously used media tool. Most importantly, they shape the responsibility of both scientists and artists, as well as the recipients of the work, towards disasters and the violence that comes with them. The examples of the methodologies I mentioned are based on action and creation of a kind of toolkit for agency in complex, unexpected, and sometimes even hopeless situations. In their rudiments, they have embodied care for human and non-human beings as a critical aspect for artistic practices in times of crisis. For almost 10 years, with Dr. Michał Krawczak, we've been searching this kind of methodologies practice, and hopefully next year our 2 books will come, and you can find more examples and maybe more research results from Aesthetics of Radical Truth and Spectral Archives of Nuclear Gaia. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and I think we've got a lot of time for discussions, so would like to ask some questions.
Hi Agnieszka, thanks so much for this very interesting lecture. Lots of different, diverse kinds of art making there. I found it very inspiring. I was particularly taken with the work, I can't remember the name of the artists, I'm afraid, but I'm going to look it up later. These guys who did this work in Fukushima with these, was it actually with the people who lived in the houses originally and they put on clothes, and were they their clothes or were they...
Their clothes.
But they had been left behind.
Left behind, but then they could come for like 1 hour, like 15 times a year. And during this field work, they were working with Takeuchi Kota, and they prepared this kind of pictures. But artists and residents, they were work together, because this group don't follow the Wind Collective. They also work with people, residents who are living outside the zone. So it's hours of discussions and talks with people and just coming from like 1 hour into the zone to have the intervention in this.
Yeah, I think it's an amazing testament to how all of that preparation and research can result in such a powerful set of images, because they really are incredible, those images, and yet very simple on the surface, aren't they? I just wanted to ask you if the artists that you've been talking about, are they specifically interested only in that one case in terms of this kind of disaster art making, or do they sort of extrapolate their practice, go and find other disasters that, if you like, that they want to make art about? Do they specialize effectively in that field?
Thank you so much for this question. I think it's very important because in the context of Don't Follow the Wind, the collective consists of 12 artists. I mentioned just several of them. It was also Ai Weiwei in this collective. I didn't mention him. But I think it was this situation, this particular crisis, this particular research, and this particular project. So the artists came from many different perspectives on methodologies and research and artistic output. But forensic architecture as collective, they are devoted to use media, experimental practices, to create a new media evidence of violence against people and environment. So they are based at Goldsmith University in London. Susan Schuplich is also connected with them. But all her, as you can of course check on the website, all her work are kind of testimonies of the climate change, climate crisis in the political, social context. The politics of cold, it's her notion. It's not just the ice cores, but how we produce the politics of cold, who can be affected by the cold, and why, and how politicians use cold to, for example, make people be silent.